This is a letter from the GAO, United States Government Accountability Office, Washington, D.C., 20548, B-304272. The date of this letter is the February 17th, 2005, and it's addressed to the heads of departments, agencies and others concerned. The subject is prepackaged news stories. Since 1951, Congress has enacted an annual government-wide prohibition on the use of appropriated funds for purposes of publicity or propaganda. During the past year, we found that several prepackaged news stories produced and distributed by certain government agencies violated this prohibition. In the course of our work, we learned that prepackaged news stories have become common tools of the public relations industries, and that some federal agencies are adopting them as well. The purpose of this letter is to remind agencies of the constraints imposed by the publicity or propaganda prohibition on the use of prepackaged news stories and to advise vigilance to assure that agencies' activities comply with the prohibition. Importantly, prepackaged news stories can be utilised without violating the law, so long as there is clear disclosure to the television viewing audience that this material was prepared by or in cooperation with the government department or agency. Prepackaged news stories are complete audio-video presentations that may be included in video news releases or VNRs. They are intended to be indistinguishable from news segments broadcast to the public by independent television news organisations. To help accomplish this goal, these stories include actors or other hired to portray reporters, and may be accompanied by suggested scripts that television news anchors can use to introduce the story during the broadcast. These practices allow prepackaged news stories to be broadcast without alteration as television news. Among other things, typical VNRs may also be B-roll video clips, advertisements and public service announcements. As a general matter, B-roll video clips of government officials discussing programmes do not violate the prohibition. Advertisements and public service announcement that includes the appropriate disclosures are also not objectionable. The current publicity or propaganda prohibition states, "No part of any appropriation contained in this or any other act shall be used for publicity or propaganda purposes within the United States, nor heretofore authorized by the Congress." The language of the prohibition has remained virtually unchanged since 1951. We have previously taken exception to an agency's use of appropriated funds to produce printed materials that concealed the agency's role in sponsoring the materials. State Department retained contractors to prepare and have published newspaper articles and op-ed pieces as the ostensible position of persons not associated with the government. Small Business Administration prepared and distributed to newspapers suggested editorials for publication as the ostensible editorial position of the recipient newspapers. In 2 cases this year, the agencies commissioned and distributed pre-packaged news stories and introductory scripts that their activities that were designed to be indistinguishable from news stories produced by private news broadcasters. In neither case did the agency include any statement or other indication in its news stories that disclosed to the television viewing audience the target of the purported news stories. The agency wrote and produced those news stories. In other words, television viewing audiences did not know that stories they watched on television news programs about the government were, in fact, prepared by the government. We concluded that those prepackaged news stories violated the publicity or propaganda prohibition. While agencies generally have the right to disseminate information about their policies and activities, Agencies may not use appropriated funds to produce or distribute pre-packaged news stories intended to be viewed by television audiences that conceal or do not clearly identify to the television viewing audience that the agency was the source of those materials. It is not enough that the contents of an agency's communication may be unobjectionable. Neither is it enough for an agency to identify itself to the broadcasting organisation as the source of the prepackaged news story. As we stated above in B302710, in a modest but meaningful way, the publicity or propaganda restriction helps to mark the boundary between an agency making information available to the public and agency creating news reports unbeknownst to the receiving audience. This is not the only marker Congress has enacted to delineate the boundaries between the government and the free American press. Restricting the domestic dissemination of news reports originally created by the government for broadcast alone. Statutory limits on the domestic dissemination of US government-produced news reports reflect concern that allowing the government to produce domestic news broadcasts would infringe upon the freedom of the press and constitute, or at least give the appearance of, an attempt to control public opinion. Agency officials should scrutinise any proposed pre-packaged news stories to ensure appropriate disclosures. Should you or your staff have questions concerning the application of these principles in particular cases, our Office of General Counsel is available to assist on an informal consultative basis or, as necessary, on a formal decision basis. And that's signed by David M. Walker, Comptroller General of the United States. This just makes you ask the question, so at the moment, what is the prepackaged news stories that we're seeing now? This is from 2005. I'll leave the link below.